Welcome back to the Steady Anchor Podcast. I am Luke, your host, and this is episode 72, covering the Young, Restless, and Reform movement, with special guest, the Restless Podcast. So, today we're covering a topic that may be familiar to a lot of our listeners, or may be unfamiliar. The Young, Restless, and Reform movement was kind of a cultural movement within the church between the early 2000s to the late 20-teens, with the rise of the Reformed theology and different components of it. It rose with some key figures, producing countless blogs and podcasts and conferences, but in the end, many figures left. Many figures fell out of their position in the churches through a variety of circumstances. And so I think that there's a lot of lessons that we can learn from the rise and fall of this movement, and maybe talk about some of the good that it came from it as well. So to help me with that discussion, today I have the hosts of the Restless Podcast, Matthew and Michael. Gentlemen, welcome to the show. Tell us about yourselves.
Hey, well, thanks for having us, Luke. Looking forward to finally getting to sit down and have this conversation. Matt and I have both been listening to different parts of your podcast, so it's been enjoyable to get to know you in that way. It would be nice to have a real conversation now. Mm-hmm. So my name is Michael Bowman. I'm a pastor of PCA Church, Presbyterian Church in America, over in La Crosse, Wisconsin, which is right along the Mississippi. And Matt, I don't know if you want to jump in.
Yeah, my name is Matt. I am a member of said PCA Church. I've worked in a number of ministries over time. I primarily do some leadership training now, and I am I don't know what we want to call me, the editor at large of the Restless Podcast.
Matt is the brains editor. He really does all of the work. I just join him and talk.
Yeah, he's got the skillful editing fingers and whatnot.
That's right.
So if you could, tell me, how did you guys grow up in Christian households, how you came to faith in Christ, and how that led to the Restless Podcast?
Great. Yeah. Actually, Michael and I, it's sort of funny that our family histories go back. Our mothers are friends from the same evangelical church movement, though we became Reformed, which is an important part of our story because it's where we intersect with the New Calvinists. We did so totally separately. So I was raised in a first-generation Christian home, and obviously through things like the Sinner's Prayer was encouraged to make it my own.
Of course.
Yeah.
Same here.
However, through my high school and into college, I had essentially treated such things as fire insurance. However, when I came in contact with a campus ministry and actually a Reformed church that were in partnership, my life began to change in ways it hadn't before. I saw people passionate about Christ. I saw passion, openness among men that I'd never seen. And then about a year into that, someone handed me a book by the venerable Mark Driscoll, and the rest is history from there.
Michael,
sorry, I'll jump in, I guess. So I also likewise grew up in a Christian home. I grew up in the Evangelical Free Church of America, and was there in that denomination really until just a few years ago. But I really didn't start to take the faith seriously until high school. Once that happened, I was put into contact with several people that became mentors to me, began to disciple me, people who had been very much influenced by men like R.C. Sproul, J.I. Packer, John Piper. And so I began to get some of that. But what started me kind of down the path of Reformed theology was also some of these men from the Young Restless Reform movement, especially Mark Driscoll. I saw some clips from him, and all of a sudden I entered that space where I was listening to sermon after sermon and going to all of the kind of new Calvinist blog sites. And that's what started to get me more and more interested in deeper theological study. As soon as I really began to take the faith seriously, I believe it I believe I was converted early in high school. That's the best way I could describe it. And as soon as that happened, I just started to read the Bible, and I just never stopped. That's how I feel. Like it just started and it hasn't stopped, and I just kept reading and rereading and studying deeper and deeper. And so that kind of these different influences and that study kind of took me to the point where I was encouraged to go to seminary. So I have a Master of Divinity from Trinity Evangelical Divinity School, and I from there ended up moving back to my hometown, which is La Crosse, Wisconsin, or that area, where we found a PCA church. At the time, I'd still been in the free church. I was basically trying to figure out, how do I be Paedo Baptist and Reformed in every way, but in a denomination where that's not necessarily well appreciated.
Yeah.
But then I moved, and I had the opportunity to go to a different church, and found this church that I'm at now, became a member, became an intern, then was ordained, and here I am.
All right. Well, thank you guys for sharing your stories. I love hearing the different testimonies of people of how they came into a personal involvement and a personal faith in Christ and his work. What the Puritans called the religion of the heart, that it's not just external, but an internal reality. I love hearing those stories and also seeing the little parallels between my own stories and others. So like you, Matthew, I grew up in a fairly non-theological SBC church where the sinner's prayer, that was everything. I'd said it when I was 7, and then boom, you're in. Doesn't matter that I didn't believe it or understand it until many years later, but I also think it's interesting that I came in at the very end of this. So I came into Reformed theology after Driscoll had already left Mars Hill and whatnot. So I just never got to share that experience. So I also, just a side note, my roommate is about to go to TEDS in this next year. So I'll have to, if you have any tips for him, I'll be sure to send those his way.
Oh yeah.
I also wanted to mention, is it like part of the uniform to be a PCA pastor to have a shaved head and a beard? Because I know at least 2 or 3 other PCA pastors who have the same look.
Mine is more or less just by necessity, because I'm starting to bald. And
Gotcha.
So if I let my hair grow any longer, it would just start to look very stringy and thin. So my wife would not let me have any other look.
Gotcha. So no imitation of Tim Keller or anything going on. All right.
No, nothing like that. No.
But the Restless Podcast is home to only bearded gospel men. So the beard is a non-negotiable.
Yeah,
but
that's a necessity.
Luke, I think you actually bring up a really good point, even mentioning that you were never enthralled by Driscoll like we were. A lot of the experiences Michael and I share in the Young, Restless, and Reform, you wouldn't, because you're younger, and maybe your audiences as well, I don't know. But what is so important for them to understand is, because I assume you largely speak to conservative evangelicals,
right,
is the table that they're sitting at was largely set by the New Calvinists. The landscape of how things are, especially on a broad level, not, again, this is maybe a problem, not at necessarily their local church level, but at the conference level, at the new media level, this table, these influences that I'm sure were acting on you and are currently acting on others, came from this movement, and that's it's. And for that reason, hopefully for your listeners today, this can be they can understand why this is an important conversation.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I listening through the episodes of your guys' show, I heard about it from Rob McKenzie, who you guys interviewed a few weeks back, and I went through and binged your stuff. I'm a podcast fiend, so any new show, anything interesting, just throw that on the queue and run through it real quick. But it was eye-opening for me. Like you said, a lot of the culture in which I came into was already set on these foundations from a particular culture, a particular, largely white conservative evangelical movement. So for those of us who maybe aren't as familiar with all this work, all this came from, could you introduce us? Where did this movement start?
Yeah, I'll start, Michael, and please jump in if there's anything you want to add. Well, the New Calvinist movement, right, is it was given that name actually by Crossway Publishers later, which is kind of funny. But
Hmm.
basically, right, when we think of a movement in general, right, we're thinking about a group of people with some shared purpose, right, entering into a social space. And what the term young, restless, and reformed or new Calvinist is trying to describe is that suddenly it seemed like Calvinist leaders and churches were overrepresented in evangelicalism
Hmm.
like they weren't before. Um, and so, like most social movements, right, there isn't one cause we can really like, this is the reason, this is the person. Though we do, for the sake of being able to talk about it all, have to simplify it a little bit,
Hmm.
right? And so, if you ask us the dates, right, the dates we give is we think it was generally a thing. When was it a thing? Probably from it started in like 1997, and by I'd say I don't know 2017, probably earlier than that, probably yeah 2015 is probably the time where we stopped talking about it in a movement format. So right, the reason I'm putting it at 1997, the Passion Conference starts. This
Hmm.
is John Piper now speaking to lots of young evangelicals. Mark Dever publishes 9 Marks of a Healthy Church. Maybe the next year or that year, Acts 29, that the Church Planning Network is founded.
Hmm.
We carry through with all of these growing influences. In 2008, Colin Hansen writes the book, The Young, Restless, and Reformed, which is really what's trying to chronicle this sudden interest in Calvinist theology.
Hmm.
And that's where we actually get the term New Calvinism. Crossway, I think, made the subtitle "My Journey with the New Calvinists," and that's where that name came from.
Hmm.
2009, the world notices and puts New Calvinism as one of the top 10 ideas changing the world right now, which is a strange thing for a subset
Yeah.
of evangelical Christianity
It's
to be
wild to
considered
think.
that way.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's wild. And at that time, probably, if we're going to list the 3 big kind of mega church names in that space, it's Mark Driscoll, who we've already mentioned, John Piper, probably Tim Keller, right?
Hmm.
And I would say by the end of 2014, when Mars Hill closes, and a few other things, just a lot of the leaders some of them have left, but at that point in my mind, we've come back to another kind of a new stability. But along the way, we've started things like the Gospel Coalition, Together for the Gospel.
Hmm.
Any number of these kinds of figures and ministries have come out of this.
Right. An infinite
And
number of podcasts.
that's right, literally an infinite number of
So
podcasts.
many.
John, in an episode that we're doing where John Piper describes this, he talks about an army of social media advocates. Like,
Yep.
and I think he's just right about that. And so that would be my elevator pitch as to what the Young, Restless, and Reformed was. Michael, do you have anything to add to that history?
Yeah, maybe if I just wrap it all up. The Young, Restless, Reform, New Calvinism was a kind of resurgence within conservative evangelicalism of certain aspects of Calvinism or Reformed theology, depending on how we are defining that. Specifically, the 5 points of Calvinism. But it was always an evangelical movement. Now, this is something that came up with Rob McKenzie when he was interviewed on the podcast. Is he talked about there being kind of 2 phases of the Young, Restless, and Reformed, and he was part of what he considered the first phase, which was really the same kind of resurgence that happened amongst kind of conservative dispensational evangelicals, and especially having to do with the rise of what was called the lordship salvation controversy, whether or not you can be saved without Jesus being your Lord or not. You had this big debate, especially between John MacArthur and Charles Ryrie at the time. And this is something where Rob pointed out that within that movement, many of those men who kind of, discovered Calvinism at that time moved into a more kind of historic, confessionally reformed fold. Whereas when you come to the new Calvinism, as Matt and I have known it, it was much more uncommon to have that kind of a move. It's not that it didn't happen. Obviously, I mean, that's where I ended up in a more confessionally reformed tradition, but it was somewhat uncommon. You had much more of continued evangelicalism as opposed to moving to that more historic tradition.
That is an important thing that Rob really added when we talked to him about this and his connections, that, he calls it the first wave. We might call it all the things setting up this influence into Reformed theology through the late 80s into the 90s, right? And that it's people Michael said, it's people coming to Calvinism out of fundamentalism. But books that are being written at that time: Chosen by God, R.C. Sproul; Desiring God, John Piper; Council of Biblical Manhood and Womanhood are founded, right? And then obviously the major, maybe the inciting incident is the lordship controversy between MacArthur and Ryrie at the time. And so, I think that's an important thing that kind of put the influences in place that acted, that, kind of unfolded into the new Calvinists like Michael and I.
Yeah, so we see kind of a confluence of the different factors. Like you said, there's always more factors at play than we recognize, but there's a few main ones we can kind of see where they come together. So, like you said, you see the 70s and the 80s, these theological conflicts that are developing in the church that are kind of driving more people out of dispensationalism, out of kind of the Billy Graham sinner's prayer mentality into that more deeper confessional theology. And that kind of sets the stage for this new era. So there's the people who are newly Calvinists, and then there are the new Calvinists, if that makes sense. The 20-year period you kind of talked about, where for some reason all of these books and all of these podcasts and all these sermon feeds and stuff, when all that starts to get more popularized because of internet culture and all of these new media, it's the perfect storm, basically, for this thing to go mainstream in a way that it couldn't in previous generations. So if you guys could delineate maybe some more of the key ideas, what really characterized the movement. We already talked about, obviously, the defining 5 points of Calvinism, which, from my early understanding, that was basically all of it. But there's obviously more going on there.
I think as we've investigated thus far on the show, I do think Colin Hansen's Young, Restless, and Reformed have kind of helped us understand it. And there's Michael, you can add in some of the maybe things that aren't necessarily in step with more confessional Calvinism and describe its relationship to evangelicalism. But I'll talk about these things, right? It's the Reformed means the 5 points, right? The Young is that it is a movement that is, as we describe it, coming through youth culture, right? So the internet, conferences, but it is taking a distinctly young look, right? It looks like me. It sounds like the music I listen to. It's the leaders are young. And then the restlessness is that it is also a reaction, again, as you mentioned, there are these conflicts. It's a reaction against what was called the emergent church, right? It's just a form of liberalism growing in evangelicalism, and a reaction against the evangelical, if we agree that Jesus is our savior, we don't need to agree on everything else, right? This big box, mega church, evangelicalism, right? And it's saying, I don't want those things. I'm restless. I'm looking for something else. And the answer was this Calvinist soteriology that was seen as taught in the Bible. Obviously, it is. We all agree on that, no doubt. Through kind of cultural means that are familiar to me.
Yeah, it was an attempt in a lot of ways to make these things relevant. And one of the things that we've been looking at more recently is how there was this desire from many of these new, young, kind of up and coming leaders, church leaders, to draw upon or to try to connect themselves to those who were maybe more traditionally historically reformed. So they would want to pull from guys like R.C. Sproul, like J.I. Packer, those who had kind of broken out of the just reformed world and gotten into mainstream evangelicalism. And it was almost as if, you kind of want that approval, but the way that you then go about sharing those truths, the way that you believe the church should be structured as far as ecclesiology, your understanding of the best means of evangelism, all of these things were still untouched by historic reformed understandings. And so this is why, we've kind of come to see this as, this is an evangelical movement that kind of took these pieces from Reformed theology, but it was never a Reformed movement. It calls itself that, right? It's the young, restless, and Reformed, but it's Reformed as far as what an evangelical would understand as Reformed, which is these 5 points.
Yep.
It's also something, because it's evangelical, it's not primarily covenantal. Right. So the focus is still on individuals as individuals, not as who they are within groups. There's a kind of pietistic bent, explicitly so. So we've recently recorded and listened through a talk that John Piper gave on kind of, what is it that made New Calvinism new? And as part of that, he points out that it is pietistic. It is focused on the affections, and he doesn't want to lose the side that is intellectual and focused on the objective.
Right.
But ultimately, anything coming out of evangelicalism is by nature it's pietistic in that it's all about what is internal, what has to do with the affections, how you feel about something. That is the primary focus or the primary lens through which you look at everything. And so all of that kind of, coming together led to this, very, for a time, relevant, exciting, cool movement that drew many of us while we were young.
Definitely. I think one of the key words you used there was relevant. Like there was a generation of young men and women who grew up in the church and were kind of dissatisfied. Like this is partially reflective of my own experience, is that when I came really starting to grow into maturity as a Christian, I was looking for more substance, and I just didn't find it in the environment I grew up in. And so you have all these younger people who are looking through the podcast and stuff, and they're finding people who, like Driscoll and Piper, are taking these core elements of confessional theology and making them effective and effective, right? They're popularizing them. They're making them more accessible. They're using the best websites and the best sound design and stuff. And they're also appealing to the emotions. That this is something that affects the way that we live. I also think, like we talked about, the Gospel Coalition, which is very, I would say, Kuyperian in the way that it writes. It's very much about influencing culture and also reflective of Tim Keller and his whole outlook on ministry. So talking about a couple of these key figures. So for instance, for anyone who, like me, didn't grow up or get introduced to Driscoll until later on, who were some of these key figures and what roles did they play in this movement?
Yeah. Let me just say that, again, the point you made is one of the major innovations. The reason they had the influence they did was the use of technology, right? When the new Calvinists are starting to put out podcasts, and it's literally just sermons at that point. You can get the Gospel Coalition sermons. You can get Mark Driscoll's sermons, right? To get Leonier's talks, I still have to write a check and they'll mail me a CD. Right? Just, you laugh because that's unimaginable.
It's so foreign to me at this point. Yeah.
Right. But they started doing that. So, oh wow, every sermon this guy's ever preached, and there are a number of figures that are that way. But yeah, the personalities in the space were so important because is a very personality driven thing. If you look at Colin Hansen's book, the kind of original figures he starts looking at is I think rightly so, he credits, and John Piper, even in the talk Michael has mentioned, self-consciously says he is one of the fathers of New Calvinism.
Hmm.
So John Piper is very influential. He's very important, right? We have another figure is Albert Mohler. Then we have Ligon Duncan. These guys kind of come together to form these associations, Gospel Coalition, Together for the Gospel. We have very important, though waning in importance today, would be guys like C.J. Mahaney,
Mm-hmm.
Joshua Harris, and the Sovereign Grace Ministries that existed that were very influential at the time. You've already mentioned Tim Keller. Michael, who am I forgetting?
Well, we actually even haven't quite gotten this far in our podcast because we're focusing on kind of the beginning of this movement and where it started. So we're working with these kind of key figures, but other very popular names that came out of this movement that were connected to it, that still have some influence within the church would be guys like Matt Chandler. Obviously, I think probably every evangelical knows who Matt Chandler is, right? So he's still very influential. You've got Francis Chan, right? He was very popular for a time, and so all of these different guys are kind of connected in various ways. But David Platt,
the whole 116 crew, yeah,
that's right. Kevin DeYoung, right? Anyone who's been published by the Gospel Coalition, you
or
can
Crossway,
pretty much put their name there.
Yeah,
right.
I think maybe one figure that's possibly emblematic of this, at least it seems like in hindsight, was Mark Driscoll. So maybe talk about how he came to prominence with Mars Hill and maybe where that went wrong, and that may lead us into our next point of discussion.
Yeah, Michael and I have a soft spot in our discernmenty hearts for Mark Driscoll. And I can talk about the positives here at the end, but right, he goes, he does all of the things that become kind of the hallmarks of what the new Calvinists were hoping to do. He goes, he plants a church, and if anyone who's listened to him a lot knows how big of a deal he made it in Seattle. There are more dogs than Christians here. He said it all the time, right? He talked about, and so right, church planting was forefront. It was, I'm taking just the Bible, just faithful teaching, but I'm taking it to the streets. I'm taking it to everyone. I am, we are not going to budge on doctrine at all, except that now he has called Calvinism garbage.
Yeah.
We're not gonna budge at all on any of those things, but we are going to accept the cultural forms. So we have a record label, we have the best websites, we have the best, right? At that point, and again, this was my subjective experience. Nobody else was operating on the cultural level that he was.
And just to point that out a little bit more, I mean, you have things like Driscoll's being interviewed on ABC Nightline, right? You're watching this very mainstream, very well watched show, and they're interviewing Mark Driscoll and driving around Seattle with him, where he's talking about C.H. Spurgeon, and he's talking about how Starbucks is an idol, and and they're sharing that here's this young old school Calvinistic preacher. This huge thing. It was that big. He was top of the iTunes charts all the time. This was a phenomenon.
Time mentions him as one of the leading voices, right? They pick him out. And sadly, a lot of the problems you're going to love New Calvinism if you liked evangelicalism, because we got all the same stuff and all the same problems.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so just like the way you can watch any evangelical leader flame out, he flames out. Now, obviously, what was notable at the time is he didn't flame out for what sadly many pastors do, adultery, things like this. He flamed out simply because of character, organizational things, ecclesiastical problems in his church, and a refusal to budge. And so a mega church, multi-site, I don't know, multi-million-dollar endeavor,
too big to fail, they thought.
Definitely thousands of people involved in this. Literally one Sunday closes.
Yeah.
And so, as impressive as a figure he was, that is an impressive way to flame out.
Yeah.
Right. So Rick Warren comes and preaches the last message that Mars Hill Church ever heard. And so it's just, he over time, right, he leaves the Gospel Coalition Council. There are all these signs of it, but he is Michael and I are continue to be interested by him because we find him to be inherently interesting.
Yeah.
And he continues to be, as he now has started another church. Pastor Mark, as we always say on our show, if you happen to be listening to the Steady Anchor podcast, we'd love to interview you on our show.
Yeah.
Love to
or
have
on this
you.
show if you'd prefer.
I don't know if I want to take the flack for that, but if
That's
Pastor
fine.
Mark's listening,
that's great. Yeah, sorry.
feel free
We're
to come
sorry,
to
Luke.
Restless.
You are. That's right. You are much younger. You should not be signing up for this kind of flack.
We kind of want the flack.
We're here for the flack.
Yeah.
That is definitely a motto coming to the Restless show.
Yeah. I just start getting messages. You're interviewing who? What year is this?
You might, because the January slate of shows might be described as "we're here for the flack." So
Great.
But, anyways,
yeah. So
yeah, no. So I think he is emblematic in many ways of it.
Yeah, and I don't want to focus on these things just to sling mud. Obviously, like we are.
Right.
I'm pursuing ministry. Michael is an elder in the church. Matthew, you're a servant of the church. And so we want to, as brothers, we don't want to just unnecessarily bad talk these people who are professing Christians, at least most of them. But we do also want to be honest about the issues that came out of this movement.
If you don't think you were put in a similar position with a similar amount of fandom following you around, money, if you don't think you would be susceptible to similar problems, and I mean, his family at least seems intact. I don't know. Obviously, we don't. Michael and I stopped following him before the fallout, but if you don't think you would be susceptible to the similar kinds of failures, character issues, all of those things, you are not being honest with yourself.
Right. Yeah.
This is what it's so easy to do, to see yourself as far better than you actually are. I see this all the time. If you ever had the conversation, everybody's had this conversation, I think, when some kind of lottery is really high in the numbers, and I don't play the lottery, but anytime it's like, hey, the Powerball is $1 billion. Hey, what would you do with $1 billion?
Yeah.
And all of us would be like, well, I'd give a bunch to the church, and I would do missions, and I would do all of these things. And my answer has now become, well, if I won $1 billion from the Powerball, I would probably divorce my wife and commit suicide. Yes. And I know that sounds extreme. It's just, that is what happens to almost everybody that wins these large amounts of money, because all of a sudden you're put in a position where all of your flesh, you can
there's no
finally
limit.
Give it what it wants. There's no limit, and you're in that position. And so we want to make clear too, our podcast, we do go hard sometimes at some of this stuff, but honestly, we are tremendously grateful for how God used so much of it in building us up and helping us to move toward maturity and helping us to understand his word better. And so, we do try to remain positive about those things which were positive, because we really are deeply grateful for much of what came out of this movement.
Definitely.
We just still believe in the T. We still just believe in total depravity.
Yeah. Yeah. And no one who understands the doctrine of depravity can ever look at someone else's sin and say, I would never, right?
Right.
By God's grace, I am where I am, and am not in a far worse place.
By the grace of God go I.
Exactly. Yeah.
No doubt.
And as you've said, God can draw straight lines with crooked sticks, right? Like he can use broken and fallen people, the ministry of people who have even left the faith, to do good things in its day. God is working all things for our good, even the things that don't turn out the way that we thought they would. So, like, for instance, Francis Chan was something who was hugely important to me when I was coming into more substantive theology. Like at one point in high school, I had listened to every sermon of Francis Chan on YouTube. And that's kind of carried over into the way that I still try and process material like that, because I want substance. But I grew really attached to characters like that. And seeing now that Francis Chan has gone to a very different place, he left his church because he felt convicted that he was becoming an idol in their community, and then moved to China for a few years, I think, and has gone through substantial theological change to where at this point he's taking selfies with Benny Hinn, and he's dabbling in transubstantiation, and he's talking to Eastern Orthodox people about their thoughts and struggling with those things. And so that's kind of one of the many cases of these main figures of this movement who unfortunately have gone and made sinful mistakes. Some even have left the faith. So you have, I believe, Joshua Harris, who is now a professing atheist. You have many of these musicians who have left orthodoxy altogether. So, like, I still listen to most of the stuff that was put out by the Mars Hill music bands, but Dustin Kensrue now rejects depravity, rejects the doctrine of hell, is a universalist, and it rejects inerrancy and all these things. So you have repeated scandals from different churches where sexual sin is being covered up by people in leadership, and that causes churches to split and bad things to happen, obviously. You have even in especially this last year or so, a lot of accusations of people in these big figures compromising in the issue of social justice and intersectionality. So we want to be honest.
So you're here for the flack too, then, if you're gonna bring that up.
Well, I'm not saying that I'm accusing them. I'm also not saying that I'm not accusing them, right? I'm saying that all of us are wrong in some areas, right? We want to be honest of where we ourselves are insufficient, looking through a glass darkly, but we also want to learn from the mistakes that others have made so that we ourselves do not commit with them. That the one who stands take heed lest he should fall. So, brothers, what do you think are some of the good lessons that we can learn from this movement? What are some of the good things, and what can we make sure doesn't happen again in the future?
Yeah, I'll just share one thing, and then I think Pastor Michael will be able to do a good job at this. Obviously, we are still, we are working our way through this material. We are working our way through this movement. I think a big thing we've noticed so far, though, we would love to have you on when we do some reaction clips to Francis Chan, if you'd enjoy doing those with us.
Absolutely.
What we realized is, the new Calvinists, they unify around soteriology. I'd say justification and soteriology. Mm-hmm. And as a whole, it begins to fall apart when we have to move on to other topics. It begins to fall apart when we have to move on to ecclesiology, because now obviously there are Baptists and there are Presbyterians, and there are other, then we get into I'm sorry if you're a listener and you're listening and this offends you, we get into the wacky ecclesiology, like multi-site corporation models, right?
Yeah, I'm a 9 marks guy still, so that's kind of
right. Yeah. No, that's great. But then we then we now and you have already mentioned this, spoiler alert, when we have to start doing public theology, the center can't hold anymore.
Right.
There was a form of unity that was sought that was probably not healthy, or at least could not hold. And this is, I'm saying I don't have an answer to this yet. This is something we're trying to work through. Why one of the reasons we're doing the show is we need to come up with a new model. And maybe it just is, this is the same problem evangelicalism has, and it has always had. And so,
right.
But that's a big question we're kind of pursuing with the podcast.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, there were so many positive things that came from. There's so many of us who, this was what drove us into reading the Puritans and reading some of these older Reformed guys and reading some of the confessions and creeds of the past. And so it was like a driving force in many ways for us to get into scripture and to get into the history of the church and to understand these things a lot deeper. There was definitely benefits as far as that goes, but also the way that everything has kind of fallen apart and the way that so many of these men went, what it does show you is that there was a deep need for accountability, right? There was a need for a better understanding of the church, of ecclesiology, that would give you some kind of actual accountability, that not just for the leaders, right, who fell apart, but also for all of us young men who just thought, well, I know I go to this church, but I don't really like anything about it. And what actually, I'm just going to listen to everything that, School or John Piper or whoever says about the church, and they're right. And my pastor's just kind of a dummy. You needed a better understanding of what life in the church looked like. And maybe I would say that the most important thing, especially for those who are young, in discovering these things, is there was a need to become what we've recently talked about as being churchmen. Mm-hmm. Like there's this need to love the church, to recognize what the church is, to not think idealistically and perfectionistically about the church and think, well, I need to go to Bethlehem Baptist, or I need to go to Mars Hill, or I need to go to the Village Church or whatever to find the true church. Like, this is how things are supposed to be done, and this is the way. But recognize the need to give yourself and devote yourself to the bride of Christ, especially before you're the one that you think that you get to decide how things are supposed to be run, the way things are supposed to go. So there's just a need for basically maturity, right? I mean, and this is really a need that is still there and continues to be there for evangelicalism. Evangelicalism is by nature, it is a kind of Christianity that is in deep need for true maturity of faith. And so that was still there, even though you have the 5 points of Calvinism. That part didn't go away.
Right. So basically, to boil a lot of that down, really it's just finding a good way to grow, mature as believers and thinkers as well. So obviously, the three of us being confessional believers, we know that Christianity is more than just what makes our heart warm, right? It is also what engages the mind and inflames the spirit with love for our Lord. It is not just a few abstract points of doctrine, but it is a whole system of thought grounded and rooted in the Word of God, inspired by the Spirit of God, concerning the Son of God, under the sovereignty of the Father God. So the triune God and all that He has revealed about Himself, it is much deeper than just the 5 points of Calvinism, right? And that was part of me growing as a thinker and as a Christian, was going beyond just these entry points and finding a deeper unity with other believers and with the church historically than just one set of ideas about how salvation works. And I think another part is like not necessarily an ignorance of the primary sources, but a neglect of them, maybe. So, for instance, I know a lot of Calvinists who have never read the Canons of Dort, where these so-called 5 points actually come from, right? Who many have neglected the confessions that help us to put all of these pieces together into a part that really makes sense. And so if I can end this with just an encouragement to whoever's listening, I know that we have some listeners who are leaning more Arminian. I know we have some listeners who are leaning more Lutheran. But in the mainstay, I would guess that a lot of our listeners would consider themselves Calvinistic or Reformed in some sense. And so I want to echo the words of these two brothers and to say that there's a maturity that we need to seek, and we can be helped by that by studying the confessions of the church, that the London Baptist and the Westminster and even the Heidelberg, that these confessions can help us to see a deeper part of our life and practice. And so I'm going to encourage anyone who's listening to go deeper, to love their church better, to live out the theology that they're studying, and to do so always grounded in the Word of God. So that's for everybody, whether you consider yourself Reformed or not. Seek the Lord in His Word, because that is where He has promised to give us guidance and wisdom by His Spirit. So I think that just about wraps it up. I want to thank Matthew and Michael for coming on today. I want to recommend all of my listeners to go and check their podcast out. I've enjoyed it so far. One last question though: where'd you guys get that logo? The little cartoon Calvin.
My wife drew it, actually.
Really?
He's our guy. And so we probably should start selling stuff with him on it, because he's pretty. Go look at our podcast. Go look at the Restless Podcast, at least to see our logo.
Yeah,
That's right.
You got to get some mugs, get some stickers. Yeah.
That's what we got to do.
Alrighty. Well, any last words?
No, we're thankful to be able to come on. Love the conversation. Yeah, thanks for the time, and hope it was helpful. Even if you're an Arminian or a Lutheran, to understand why it seems like all these smart Calvinist guys are the popular people. Maybe now you know why.
Yeah, thanks for having us on, Luke. This was great.
Absolutely. Thanks again, guys. Hope to talk to you again soon. Until next week, love God, love His church, and love your neighbor as yourself. God bless.